I'm excited to welcome you to my channel. Before I dive into my story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. As the family's old truck rumbled down the dirt road, the towering pines of the wilderness closed in around them, their branches swaying gently in the late afternoon breeze. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. Henry leaned his head against the window, watching the scenery blur past, feeling the familiar anticipation of their annual fishing trip mix with an uneasy tension that had been building for days. When the truck finally pulled up to the secluded lake, the sight should have been a welcome one. The water stretched out like a mirror, reflecting the golden light of the setting sun and the deep greens of the surrounding forest. But as Henry stepped out of the truck and stretched his legs, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Tom, his younger brother, climbed out of the truck with slow, heavy movements, his usual energy noticeably absent. He stood by the edge of the lake, staring at the water without saying a word. Maggie and Dan began unloading the gear, their conversation forced and shallow, as if they were trying too hard to maintain a sense of normalcy. "Henry, can you help with the tent?" Dan called, his voice strained. "Yeah, sure," Henry replied, his eyes lingering on Tom for a moment longer before he joined his father. They worked in near silence, the sound of zippers and rustling fabric filling the space where easy chatter used to be. Maggie moved quietly around the campsite, setting up the portable stove and laying out the sleeping bags, her shoulders tense. Henry noticed the way she glanced at Tom every few minutes, her worry barely concealed. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, the family gathered around the fire pit. Dan struck a match and lit the kindling, the flames crackling to life with a burst of warmth. They sat together, watching the fire dance, but the usual excitement and laughter that accompanied the start of their fishing trips was missing. Tom sat a little apart from the others, his gaze fixed on the flames, his face pale in the flickering light. Henry wanted to ask if he was okay, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he poked at the fire with a stick, the unease in his chest growing. The lake, usually a place of peace and happiness, felt different this time. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. And as the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that this trip would be unlike any they'd had before. The sun rose gently over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the glassy surface of the lake. The stillness of the morning was broken only by the soft lapping of water against the boat as Henry, Tom, Maggie, and Dan set out for their first day of fishing. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the faintest hint of wood smoke from the previous night's fire. As they glided across the water, the family settled into their usual routine. Dan took the oars, his strong, steady strokes propelling them toward their favorite fishing spot near a cluster of reeds. Maggie busied herself with the tackle box, selecting the lures that had served them well in past years. Henry leaned over the side of the boat, watching the ripples spread out from their wake, his thoughts drifting as he inhaled the familiar scent of the lake. But something was different this time. The light-hearted banter that usually filled the boat was absent. Instead, a heavy silence lingered in the air, broken only by the occasional call of a distant loon or the splash of a fish breaking the surface. Tom sat quietly at the stern, his rod resting across his lap. He stared out at the water, his face devoid of the excitement that usually accompanied the start of a fishing trip. Henry stole glances at him, noticing the way his brother's shoulders slumped, the dark circles under his eyes that seemed more pronounced in the soft morning light. Maggie and Dan tried to keep the mood light. Dan told a few old fishing stories, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness as he recounted the time he caught a bass so big they almost had to drag it back to shore. Maggie chimed in with memories of past trips, her laughter a little too loud, a little too bright. But Tom barely reacted, his silence casting a shadow over their attempts to keep things normal. As the hours passed, they began to catch fish, smallmouth bass, perch, and a couple of decent-sized pike. Each time the line went taut, there was a brief spark of excitement, but it quickly fizzled as Tom remained detached, barely acknowledging the catches. Even when Dan handed him the net to bring in a particularly large pike, Tom went through the motions with a distant, almost mechanical air. Henry watched his brother closely, a knot of worry tightening in his chest. This wasn't the Tom he knew. The Tom he knew would be grinning from ear to ear, trading playful jabs with Henry over who caught the bigger fish, his eyes alight with the thrill of the day. But now, it was like Tom was somewhere else entirely, his mind miles away from the peaceful lake they were drifting on. By midday, the sun was high in the sky, its rays glinting off the water and warming the air. Maggie unpacked the sandwiches she had made that morning, passing them around with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the rustle of the breeze in the trees and the occasional cry of a gull circling overhead. Henry couldn't stand the silence any longer. "Hey, Tom," he said, trying to sound casual, "remember that time we were out here and you hooked that huge bass? You practically jumped out of the boat trying to reel it in." Tom glanced up briefly, a faint shadow of a smile flickering across his face before it disappeared. "Yeah, I remember," he said quietly, before turning his gaze back to the water. The conversation faltered, and they fell back into silence. Henry exchanged a worried look with Maggie, who gave a small, helpless shrug. Dan continued to row them around the lake, but even he had stopped trying to fill the quiet with stories. The day wore on, the fish biting sporadically, but the joy that usually accompanied their catches was absent. The tension that had begun the night before now hung over them like a cloud, making the boat feel smaller, more confined. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows over the water, they decided to head back to shore. The lake was as calm as ever, but the unease that had taken hold of Henry refused to dissipate. Tom's silence was a weight on all of them, and as they docked the boat and made their way back to camp, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The morning of the second day dawned just as serene as the first, with the lake shrouded in a thin layer of mist and the sun casting a soft, golden hue over the treetops. Henry stirred in his sleeping bag, feeling the familiar anticipation of another day on the water. But as he emerged from the tent, stretching his stiff limbs and breathing in the crisp air, he noticed something was off. Tom's sleeping bag was still rolled up in the corner, untouched since the night before. The flap of his tent was closed tight, no sign of movement within. Henry frowned, a twinge of concern gnawing at him. Usually, Tom was the first one up, eager to hit the water before the sun was fully risen. But today, there was no sign of him. Maggie was already up, busying herself with breakfast over the campfire. The smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, but even that didn't draw Tom out. Dan emerged from his tent, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and yawning as he plopped down on a log by the fire. "Morning," Dan mumbled, reaching for a mug of coffee. "Where's Tom?" Henry shrugged, glancing toward Tom's tent. "Still in bed, I guess. He's not usually one to sleep in." Maggie looked up from her cooking, concern flickering in her eyes. "Maybe he's just tired. He didn't say much yesterday, and he barely touched his dinner. I noticed he didn't eat much breakfast either." "Yeah, he's been pretty quiet," Henry agreed, the worry in his voice barely masked. "I'll go check on him." Henry walked over to Tom's tent, hesitating for a moment before gently calling his brother's name. "Tom? You awake?" There was a brief pause before Tom's voice responded, muffled and low. "Yeah, I'm awake. Just not feeling great. Think I'll sit today out." Henry's concern deepened. "You sure? We can wait for you." "No, it's fine," Tom insisted. "You guys go ahead. I'll just rest here." Henry stood there for a moment, debating whether to press the issue, but something in Tom's tone warned him not to push. "All right," he finally said. "Let us know if you need anything." Tom didn't respond, and Henry reluctantly turned back to the others. Maggie was dishing up breakfast, her brow furrowed with worry. Dan was busy talking about some of their past fishing trips, his voice a little too bright, as if he was trying to keep the mood light despite the unease hanging over them. "Tom's not coming," Henry said, settling down beside the fire. "Says he's tired." Maggie handed him a plate, her lips pressed into a thin line. "He's barely eaten. I'm worried about him." Maybe it's just the stress, Dan suggested, taking a bite of bacon. He's been through a lot lately. Maybe he just needs a break. Maybe, Henry muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. Tom had never been one to shy away from the challenges life threw at him, and seeing him so withdrawn felt wrong. As they ate breakfast, the usual chatter around the campfire was subdued, each of them preoccupied with their own thoughts. Maggie focused on cooking, her movements quick and precise as she prepared lunch for later, her way of coping with the worry she clearly felt. Dan kept up the conversation, recounting fishing stories with exaggerated enthusiasm, but even he couldn't hide the underlying tension in his voice. After breakfast, they loaded up the boat, but the absence of Tom's usual energy weighed heavily on them. As they set out onto the lake, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with his brother. The water was calm and inviting, but the thrill of fishing had lost its edge without Tom there to share it with them. The hours passed, fish were caught and released, but the usual excitement was missing. Maggie, who usually laughed the loudest when someone landed a big catch, was unusually quiet, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Dan did his best to keep spirits up, cracking jokes and telling stories, but it felt forced, his usual charisma dimmed by the palpable worry that hung over them. Back at the campsite, the day dragged on with a heavy sense of unease. Tom remained in his tent, not even emerging for lunch. Henry checked on him a couple of times, but each time Tom insisted he was fine, though his voice was weak and distant. Maggie busied herself with preparing dinner, the campfire crackling softly as the sun began to dip below the tree-line, casting long shadows across the campsite. As the evening wore on, Henry couldn't take it any longer. "Tom, we're all worried about you," he said, standing just outside the tent flap. "Why don't you come out, get some fresh air?" There was a long pause before Tom finally responded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just need to rest, Henry. Please." Defeated, Henry returned to the campfire, where Maggie and Dan were waiting. "He still doesn't want to come out," Henry said, his voice heavy with concern. "I don't know what's going on with him." "We'll give him space," Maggie said, though she didn't sound convinced. "Maybe he just needs time." But as they sat around the fire, their dinner plates barely touched, it became clear that Tom's absence was more than just physical. The warmth of the fire did little to dispel the cold knot of worry in Henry's stomach, and as the night deepened, so did his fear that something was terribly wrong with his brother. The sun was already climbing in the sky by the time Henry stepped out of his tent the next morning. The lake glistened in the early light, calm and serene, a perfect backdrop for what should have been another peaceful day of fishing. But the tension from the previous night still hung over him like a dark cloud, and he could feel it growing heavier with each passing moment. He glanced over at Tom's tent, half expecting to see his brother emerge, ready for a day on the water. But the tent remained zipped shut, no movement or sound coming from within. It had been nearly 24 hours since Tom had last spoken to anyone, and Henry's unease was now impossible to ignore. Maggie was already up, busying herself with breakfast over the campfire. She moved methodically, as if going through the motions of routine would somehow make everything feel normal again. Dan was sitting nearby, fiddling with a fishing rod, trying to maintain an air of casualness that felt forced. Henry hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and walked over to his mother. "Mom," he began, keeping his voice steady, "I really think we should check on Tom." Maggie didn't look up from the skillet as she flipped the sizzling bacon. "He's just tired, Henry. You know how draining these trips can be for him. He needs his rest." "But it's the third day, and he hasn't even eaten anything," Henry pressed, his worry bubbling to the surface. "What if something's wrong? We can't just ignore it." Maggie's movements faltered for a brief moment before she composed herself. "I'm sure he's fine, Henry. He'll come out when he's ready. We shouldn't disturb him." Henry couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could she be so calm, so dismissive, when it was clear that Tom wasn't himself? Frustration mixed with his fear, and he found it harder to keep his emotions in check. "Mom, you didn't see him yesterday," Henry said, his voice rising slightly. "He wouldn't even talk to me. He's not okay." Maggie finally turned to face him, her expression firm but with a hint of exhaustion in her eyes. "Henry, I know you're worried. We all are. But your brother needs time. The best thing we can do is give him space." Henry opened his mouth to argue, but Dan cut in, his voice light but with an undercurrent of tension. "Hey, sport, why don't you help me get the gear ready for today? The fish won't wait forever, you know." Henry shot his father a look, incredulous that he could think about fishing at a time like this. But Dan seemed determined to avoid the conversation about Tom, and Henry could see that he didn't want to discuss it any further. "I don't care about the fish, Dad," Henry said, his voice firm. "I care about Tom. We need to do something." Dan sighed, putting down the rod and turning to face Henry. "We will, Henry. But like your mom said, let's give him a little more time. He might just need to work through whatever's bothering him." Henry couldn't believe what he was hearing. It felt like they were all pretending that things were normal when nothing about this situation was normal. Tom had never been like this before, and the longer they waited, the more Henry feared that something terrible was happening to his brother. "What if he doesn't come out?" Henry asked, his voice cracking slightly. "What if something really bad is going on in there, and we're just sitting here doing nothing?" Maggie's face softened, and she reached out to place a hand on Henry's shoulder. "I know it's hard, honey. But we have to trust that Tom will come out when he's ready. If he doesn't by the end of today, we'll check on him, okay?" Henry wanted to shout that it wasn't enough, that they needed to do something now, but the look in his mother's eyes stopped him. She was scared too, more than she was letting on, and Henry could see that this was her way of coping. Still, it didn't feel right to just sit back and wait. Reluctantly, he nodded, though the knot in his stomach only tightened. Maggie smiled weakly, then turned back to the breakfast she was cooking. Dan gave Henry a reassuring pat on the back, as if that would make everything better, and then went back to preparing the fishing gear. Henry stood there for a moment, feeling a sense of helplessness wash over him. He glanced back at Tom's tent, the fabric fluttering slightly in the breeze. It seemed so far away, so isolated from the rest of the world. And with every passing minute, Henry's fear grew that they were losing Tom, that his brother was slipping further and further away from them. Unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, Henry walked away from the campfire, needing a moment to collect his thoughts. He knew he couldn't just sit around all day, pretending everything was fine. But what could he do when no one else seemed to share his sense of urgency? As he stared out at the still waters of the lake, Henry made a decision. If Tom didn't come out of his tent soon, he would go in there himself, no matter what his parents said. He had to know that his brother was okay. And if he wasn't, Henry would do whatever it took to help him. Henry spent the morning casting his line into the lake, trying to focus on the gentle ripples on the water's surface and the way the sun glinted off the lures as they danced beneath the waves. But no matter how hard he tried to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of fishing, the nagging worry about Tom never left his mind. The peaceful lake, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed strangely isolating. The towering trees that surrounded the water appeared to close in around him, and the stillness of the air only amplified the sense of dread that had been growing in his chest. It was as if the entire world had shrunk to this one remote spot, and in that isolation, Henry's fears felt even more pressing. He stole glances back at the camp throughout the day, watching for any sign of movement from Tom's tent. But the flap remained tightly shut, the small space inside ominously quiet. His parents, sitting a little further down the shore, were still immersed in their own quiet conversation, occasionally throwing reassuring smiles in Henry's direction. They acted as though nothing was wrong, but Henry could see the tension in their eyes, the way they avoided looking at the tent too long. By midday, Henry's patience had worn thin. The thoughts swirling in his mind made it impossible to enjoy the day. Every time he pulled a fish from the water, the joy he usually felt was replaced by a sinking feeling in his gut. What was Tom doing all alone in that tent? Was he really just tired, or was something more sinister going on? Henry couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. He made up his mind. Enough was enough. He would check on Tom himself. If his parents wouldn't do it, then he would. They could get mad at him all they wanted, he couldn't keep ignoring that something was wrong. Without saying a word, Henry reeled in his line and set his fishing rod down on the ground. His parents were deep in conversation, their voices low, almost hushed, as if they were discussing something they didn't want him to hear. That only fueled his determination. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he walked up the small hill toward the tent. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of what he might find was already bearing down on him. The peaceful sounds of nature around him seemed distant, muted by the loud thumping of his pulse in his ears. As he reached the tent, Henry hesitated for just a moment, his hand hovering over the zipper. What if Tom was really just sleeping? What if he was fine and Henry was overreacting? But then again, what if he wasn't? Swallowing his fear, Henry grabbed the zipper and slowly pulled it down. The sound of the metal teeth parting echoed in the stillness, loud in the otherwise quiet camp. As the flap fell open, Henry's breath caught in his throat. Inside, the tent was dark, the small space heavy with an unpleasant, stale odor. Henry's eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light, and he could just make out the shape of Tom lying on his sleeping bag. His brother was curled up on his side, facing away from the entrance, completely still. "Tom?" Henry called softly, his voice trembling slightly. There was no response. The silence in the tent was oppressive, pressing down on Henry's chest and making it hard to breathe. He stepped inside, the ground beneath him crunching as he moved closer. "Tom, wake up," Henry tried again, this time louder. He reached out and gently shook his brother's shoulder. Tom didn't stir. Fear gripped Henry's heart as he knelt beside Tom, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. He shook him again, harder this time, his panic rising. "Tom, please wake up." Finally, Tom let out a low groan and shifted slightly. Relief flooded through Henry, but it was short-lived as Tom's eyes fluttered open, dull and unfocused. He looked at Henry, but it was as if he didn't really see him. "Tom, you're scaring me," Henry whispered, his voice breaking. "What's going on? Please, just talk to me." Tom blinked slowly, as if trying to piece together what was happening. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice was barely audible, dry and cracked. "I'm just tired, Henry." "No, it's more than that," Henry insisted, feeling a mix of fear and frustration. "You've been in here for days. You haven't eaten, you haven't said anything. We're all worried about you." Tom's eyes closed again, and for a moment, Henry thought he had drifted back into unconsciousness. But then Tom spoke, his voice so soft Henry had to lean in close to hear him. "I just don't have the energy," Tom murmured. "I don't know what's wrong with me." Henry's heart sank as he realized how weak and vulnerable his brother sounded. Tom wasn't just physically exhausted, something was draining him from the inside out, something that sleep alone couldn't fix. Determined not to let his brother slip away from him, Henry gently shook Tom again. "We need to get you out of here, Tom. You need help. We'll go back home, we'll get you to a doctor, whatever it takes. But you can't stay like this." Tom didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, his eyes fluttering as if he was fighting to stay conscious. Henry's fear turned to resolve as he made up his mind. He would get his parents. They couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Henry squeezed Tom's hand, trying to reassure him. "I'm getting Mom and Dad. We're going to figure this out, okay? Just hang in there." Without waiting for a response, Henry hurried out of the tent, his heart racing. He had no idea what was wrong with Tom, but he knew they couldn't wait any longer. Something was terribly wrong, and they needed to act fast. As he ran down the hill toward the campfire, where his parents still sat in quiet conversation, Henry felt a surge of urgency. This time, they would listen to him. They had to. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he pulled back the tent flap, the dread that had been gnawing at him for days now reaching a fever pitch. The air inside the tent was thick, heavy with a stale, sickly odor that hit him like a wall. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw Tom lying on his back, his face turned slightly toward the ceiling. Tom's face was ashen, almost ghostly pale, and his eyes were open but unfocused, staring blankly into nothingness. He looked so still, so lifeless, that for a moment, Henry felt frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe. The world outside the tent seemed to fade away, leaving only the oppressive silence and the overwhelming fear that something was horribly wrong. "Tom?" Henry's voice was barely more than a whisper, trembling as he forced the words out. He waited for some kind of response, a blink, a twitch, anything, but Tom remained motionless, his chest barely rising and falling with shallow breaths. Henry's panic surged. He rushed to Tom's side, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch his brother's arm. Tom's skin was cold to the touch, clammy and damp with sweat. Henry shook him gently at first, then more forcefully when there was no reaction. "Tom, wake up," Henry pleaded, his voice cracking. He could hear the desperation in his own words, but it didn't matter. He just needed Tom to respond, to give him some sign that he was still there, still with him. But Tom's eyes stayed vacant, his body limp. Henry's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts swirling in his head all at once. What was happening? What had gone wrong? And why hadn't they noticed sooner? Henry's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he leaned in closer, his ear near Tom's mouth to check if he was breathing. The faint, labored breaths offered little reassurance. He could feel the tears welling up in his eyes, blurring his vision as the smell of sickness filled the tent, making him feel nauseous. "Please, Tom," Henry whispered, his voice choking on the words. "Please, wake up. You can't leave me like this." But Tom didn't respond, and Henry's heart broke as the full weight of the situation sank in. Tom wasn't just tired or unwell, something was seriously wrong, something that none of them had wanted to admit or confront. And now, in this dark, suffocating tent, Henry was forced to face it alone. The panic inside him grew as he realized he couldn't handle this on his own. He needed help. His parents needed to see this, to understand that Tom needed more than just rest. Henry squeezed Tom's hand, holding onto the last thread of hope that his brother would squeeze back. But Tom's hand remained limp, unresponsive. The sight of his brother lying so still, so pale, filled Henry with a sense of helplessness he had never felt before. With a final, shaky breath, Henry let go of Tom's hand and stumbled out of the tent, his legs feeling like they could give out at any moment. He needed to find his parents, to make them understand that this was no longer something they could brush off or ignore. As he rushed down the hill toward the campsite, the tears he had been holding back finally began to fall. Henry knew that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. Henry burst out of the tent, his legs shaky and his breath coming in ragged gasps. The world outside felt like a cruel contrast to the suffocating darkness he had just left behind. The lake was calm, the sun casting a warm glow on the water, and birds chirped in the distance as if nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. He knew that now, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He spotted Maggie by the campfire, stirring a pot of something on the stove, while Dan sat in a folding chair, sipping coffee and staring out at the lake. They looked so peaceful, so detached from the nightmare unfolding just a few feet away. "Mom! Dad!" Henry shouted, his voice trembling with urgency as he ran toward them. Maggie turned to him with a soft smile, but it faded quickly when she saw the panic in his eyes. Dan barely looked up, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Henry, what's wrong?" Maggie asked, concern creeping into her voice. "It's Tom," Henry gasped, struggling to find the words. He's not okay. We need to do something, now." Maggie's face went pale, and her stirring spoon clattered to the ground. She took a step back, shaking her head as if trying to ward off the reality of what Henry was saying. "He just needs rest, Henry. He's been through a lot. We can't push him." "No, Mom, you don't understand," Henry cried, his frustration mounting. "He's not just tired. He's not responding, he's barely breathing. We need to get him help, right now." Dan finally looked over, his brow furrowing. "Henry, calm down," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of irritation. Tom's going to be fine. He's just exhausted. The last thing he needs is for everyone to panic. Henry turned to his father, disbelief and anger rising in his chest. Dad, you didn't see him. Something's really wrong. We can't just sit here and pretend everything's fine. Maggie's hands trembled as she reached out to steady herself on the picnic table. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, but she was still trying to hold on to the belief that Tom just needed time. Maybe he just needs more sleep. Maybe we can try to wake him later, and he'll be better. No! Henry shouted, his voice breaking. He needs help now. We need to get him to a hospital. Dan stood up, his face tight with tension. Henry, you're overreacting. Tom's strong, he'll pull through this. Let's give him more time. Time? Henry repeated, his voice full of desperation. We don't have time. If we don't do something, we might lose him. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, pressing down on all of them. Maggie's eyes welled up with tears, her hands covering her mouth as the reality of the situation finally started to sink in. Dan, however, still seemed rooted in denial, his jaw clenched as if refusing to let go of the illusion that everything was under control. Please, Henry whispered, his voice breaking. I can't do this alone. We need to help him. Maggie's tears began to spill over as she nodded, her resolve crumbling. You're right, Henry. We need to get him help. Dan shook his head, but his defiance was starting to waver. But what if it's just the stress? What if we're overreacting? Henry stepped closer, his eyes locked onto his father's. What if we're not? What if he doesn't have time for us to keep pretending? Dan's shoulders slumped as the fight drained out of him. He looked at Maggie, who was now openly weeping, then back at Henry, who stood trembling with fear and frustration. Finally, Dan sighed heavily, his voice barely above a whisper. Okay. Let's get him to the hospital. Without wasting another second, Henry turned and sprinted back to the tent, his parents close behind him. The reality of the situation was finally hitting them, but Henry could only hope it wasn't too late. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the campsite grew quiet. The air was cool, with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the surrounding trees. But for Henry, the stillness of the evening only amplified the turmoil within him. He stood by the campfire, staring at the flickering flames, but his mind was far away, back in the tent where his brother lay. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to be with Tom, even though it terrified him. The thought of seeing his brother like that again, unresponsive and pale, sent shivers down his spine. But something deeper, something stronger, urged him to go back, an instinct that told him this might be his last chance to connect with Tom. With a heavy heart, Henry turned away from the fire and walked slowly toward the tent. Each step felt like it was weighted with lead, the distance between him and the tent door stretching out impossibly long. When he finally reached the entrance, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the zipper. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to face, and then unzipped the tent with trembling fingers. The air inside the tent was thick, carrying the lingering smell of sickness that had been there earlier. The dim light from the setting sun filtered through the fabric, casting long shadows over Tom's still form. Henry's heart ached as he saw his brother lying there, exactly as he had left him, motionless, eyes open but unseeing, his chest barely rising with each shallow breath. Henry moved closer, his footsteps barely making a sound on the soft ground. He sat down beside Tom, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The memories of their childhood flooded his mind, days spent playing in the yard, fishing trips with their dad, and the countless times they'd stayed up late, laughing and talking about everything and nothing. But one memory stood out among the rest, a simple, silly game they used to play. They would sneak up on each other and flick the other's ear, seeing who could catch the other off guard. It was a small thing, a childish game, but it had always been theirs. It was a way to connect, to share a laugh, and to feel close even when words weren't enough. With tears welling up in his eyes, Henry reached out and gently flicked Tom's ear, just like he used to when they were younger. The movement was so small, so light, but it carried the weight of everything Henry was feeling: his love for his brother, his fear, his sorrow, and the deep, gnawing sense of loss that was beginning to consume him. But Tom didn't react. He didn't smile, didn't laugh, didn't even flinch. The only sound in the tent was the faint rustling of the trees outside and the quiet sob that escaped Henry's lips. Henry's hand trembled as he pulled it back, and he stared at his brother's face, willing him to move, to show some sign that he was still there, still with him. But Tom remained still, his face peaceful and serene, as if he were already somewhere far beyond the reach of Henry's desperate flick. The finality of the situation hit Henry like a punch to the gut, and he doubled over, tears streaming down his face. He knew, deep down, that his brother was gone, that no matter how many times he flicked his ear, Tom would never flick back. The realization was more than he could bear, and for a long time, he just sat there, crying softly, his heart breaking into pieces. Outside, the last rays of sunlight faded, leaving the tent in darkness. The world continued to turn, the night settling in around them, but inside that small, enclosed space, time seemed to stand still. Henry stayed by Tom's side, unable to leave, unable to say goodbye. All he could do was sit there, holding onto the memories of the brother he loved, and the knowledge that some games, once lost, could never be played again. The dawn broke quietly over the lake, its soft light glistening on the calm water. The campsite, usually a place of early morning activity, was eerily still. The only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the gentle rustle of the trees in the morning breeze. The family, however, moved in silence, their faces pale and drawn as they packed up their belongings. Henry's heart was heavy as he rolled up his sleeping bag and stowed away the fishing gear. The previous night's events had left a mark on him, a deep, painful awareness of the reality they were all now facing. Tom's absence weighed on them all, but the unspoken words and shared looks between his parents told him they were all struggling to come to terms with it in their own way. Maggie moved mechanically, her eyes glazed and distant as she folded the tent and packed away the last of their supplies. Dan's usual light-hearted demeanor was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber focus as he loaded the car. No one spoke, there was nothing left to say. Henry took one last look around the campsite. The memories of their time here, of better days spent laughing and fishing together, seemed to hang in the air, mingling with the mist that rose off the lake. He wanted to hold onto those memories, to wrap them around himself like a blanket, but they slipped through his fingers, replaced by the cold reality of the present. As they drove away from the lake, the car filled with a heavy, oppressive silence. The road wound through the trees, the lake gradually disappearing from view, but Henry couldn't bring himself to turn away. He stared out the window, watching the water until it was no longer visible, trying to imprint the image in his mind, the last place they had been together as a family, before everything changed. The drive home felt longer than usual, the car crawling along the highway as if mirroring the slow, painful passage of time. Henry's thoughts drifted to Tom, to the games they used to play, to the fishing trips and the late-night talks. The memories were bittersweet now, tinged with the knowledge that those moments were gone, never to be relived. When they finally arrived home, the silence continued. The house, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt cold and empty. Maggie headed straight to the kitchen, automatically preparing another meal, even though no one had the appetite to eat. Dan sat down at the table, his eyes unfocused, lost in thought. Henry followed, taking his usual seat, but the emptiness in the room was overwhelming. The meal was eaten in silence, each of them picking at their food, but not really tasting it. The clinking of forks against plates was the only sound, a hollow echo in the quiet house. Henry glanced around the table at his parents, noting the exhaustion etched on their faces, the sorrow in their eyes. He knew they were all thinking the same thing, but none of them could bring themselves to say it out loud. As the day wore on, the house remained quiet. Maggie busied herself with chores, Dan retreated to the garage, and Henry went to his room, where he sat in the stillness, thinking about the trip, about Tom, and about the difficult days that lay ahead. The fishing gear lay untouched in the corner, a reminder of the life they had left behind at the lake. That night, as Henry lay in bed, he finally allowed himself to cry. The tears came slowly at first, then in waves, as he mourned not just the loss of his brother, but the loss of everything that had once been. The house was no longer filled with the sounds of laughter and teasing, the shared joy of being together. It was quiet now, unbearably quiet. But in that silence, Henry found a small measure of acceptance. He knew that life would go on, even if it would never be the same. The memories of Tom, of their time together, would always be with him, but so too would the reality of their loss. As he drifted off to sleep, the sound of the lake lapping gently at the shore echoed in his mind, a distant reminder of the peace they had once known. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. But for now, Henry let himself be still, allowing the silence to wash over him, and finding in it a quiet acceptance of the road that lay ahead. This is where the story ends. Share your opinion in the comments. Did you like the story?